chi, 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 chi.
Shall start his Zoom? Okay, good.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, good afternoon, panelists. My name is Olalere Odushote, the Honorable Commissioner for Energy and Mineral Resources of the Lagos State Government. So I will be the moderator for this session, and we will soon be starting. I would just like to meet every one of you, the panelists, before we start. If you could introduce yourselves for those who are on board, and if you can hear me, it would be nice for you to confirm. So, Mr. Durosimiati, if you can hear me, can you just confirm and perhaps just introduce yourself?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, brilliant. Dr. Kemi Da Silva,
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you.
Mrs. Sandra Oyewole,
Farming, I can hear you. Thank you.
Miss Funkola Odeleye. Right, I understand she's not here yet. So thank you for the three of you. And I think we should have a brilliant session. This session is on security, law and order, specifically on balancing regulation and economic growth. I'm going to be asking you questions about the consequences of not doing this and also on the effect of regulation. So I'm going to take the questions at random, and I have a list of them. I can read them out if you'd rather decide who wants to answer what, or I can just throw it out and call all of you one by one to try and answer them, depending on how you'd like it. Okay, brilliant. I can see you now. All right, so the first set of questions would be on complications arising from introducing regulations. The special issues, the second one would be how do we present the increase in costs and unintended consequences of regulatory programs. The third one is how do we manage lack of accountability and monitoring of funds assigned to regulatory programs. And then on the consequences of poor regulation, the questions are how can we prevent insiders from gaining an advantage? Second one is how do we ensure that the vulnerable do not bear most of the costs? And the third one is how do we fast track the bureaucracy for change to keep up pace with the realities of an increasingly competitive global economy? I don't know if you got these questions ahead of time.
No.
No.
But they're not too difficult, are they?
Yeah, what we got, I mean, we got a bundle of documents, or at least I got a bundle of documents. And for instance, I had the question, how do we fast track the bureaucracy for change to keep up pace with the realities of an increasingly competitive global economy? So I got one question that...
I was given a specific question as well to answer, which I was told I'll just deep dive in for 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll try and flow through it. So when I ask the questions, just anybody who wants to pitch in can just pitch in and answer them. We're just going to, I think we've run out of time, so we will soon start letting everybody into the room, and then we'll start. So you're welcome again, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. How well? Well, thank you. Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you again to this session of Engbeti. This session is on security, law and order, and specifically this session is going to look at how we can balance regulation with economic growth. My name is Olalere Odushote. I'm the Honorable Commissioner, Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, Lagos State Government. I'll take the liberty of introducing the panelists who are all joining via Zoom. I'd like to welcome Mr. Kehinde Durosimieti. He's the chairman of the board, Lagos State Security Trust Fund. He has over 3 decades of management and leadership experience as a chartered accountant and banker. He's been with Nigerian American Merchant Bank Limited, has spent a 27-year career in banking and other financial services, 16 of which were spent in top leadership positions as managing director and CEO of 3 different banks in Nigeria: Midas Bank, Eco International Bank, and Sky Bank. Each of those times he has left those appointments of his own volition. So you're welcome, Mr. Kehinde Durosimieti. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Kemi Da Silva Ibru. She's the founder and CEO of Women at Risk International Foundation, WARIF. It's a non-profit organization that successfully tackles issues of gender-based violence, rape, and trafficking of young girls and women in communities across Nigeria. She's a specialist obstetrician and gynecologist and has a medical background that extends to public health. She's also a public health physician and an academic who's currently undergoing a PhD in gender-based violence. She has over 15 years experience in private services and private practice and dedicates her time to address the needs of girls and women. Ms. Sandra Oyewole is a partner at Olajide Oyewole, a member of the DLA Piper Africa, and has been in practice for over 26 years. She leads their intellectual property and technology practice and also co-leads the employment practice of the firm.
Ms. Mary,
she has an in-depth knowledge and experience in Nigeria's creative and innovative industries, regularly structuring deals and providing legal, business, and regulatory advice. The 4th panelist today is Ms. Funke Odeleye. She's a co-founder and director of DIY Law, a legal technology company that creates access to legal services and information. She's also the co-founder at the Lunge Practice LP, a startup-focused boutique law firm that provides cost-effective services to new businesses. In 2015, DIY Law won the Hague Institute of Internationalization of Law, SME Empowerment, Innovating Justice Challenge, East and West Africa. She holds a master's degree in finance and financial law from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. She's also one of the 200 emerging leaders from across Africa selected for the 2019 Obama Foundation Leaders Africa Program. Panelists, you're welcome. Can we do a mic check for each one of you? If you could just introduce yourselves one by one, just mentioning your names so we're sure that you're here and we can hear you.
Sandra Iwole.
Kemi Da Silva Ibru.
Nkola Odeleye.
All right, thank you very much. And you're all welcome again to this session. And to the Lagosians that are listening to us, thank you again. And I expect that you're going to have a very interesting session with us today. This session is going to be looking at balancing regulation with economic growth. The background is simply that regulations are introduced to improve the well-being of members of the society. This may also come at a cost to both the regulators and the society, as regulations minimize the room for variation in the way procedures are carried out. All parties have to adhere to legislation, and a separate monitoring body is required to monitor and enforce compliance. So I'm going to start by asking these questions, and what I will do is I will name one of the panelists to answer the question, and if there's any other panelist who feels that they can add to it, please feel free to after the first panelist has answered. So I'll start with you, Mr. Kehinde Duro-Simiati. How can we ensure that regulations respect market forces and the beneficial effects of competition?
Okay, thank you very much. I think a couple of definitions are imperative here. I mean, competition arises when people trade resources for economic benefit. There is usually a value chain process for this, wherein the goods and services are created or produced at a price that compare favorably with others, and as a result can be exchanged at for a fair financial consideration. If we're talking regulation, can be defined from the economic standpoint as the marginal social benefit which must be equal to or greater than the marginal private benefit or marginal social cost. That is an economic definition. That's how regulation relates. When you're talking marginal social cost, you're talking about the public sector, and when you're talking about private benefit, you're talking private sector. So there must be laws that regulate the market, and these will come in the form of fiscal and monetary policies from the government. We're also talking about state laws and federal government laws. You also have laws from protection agencies. Now, the regulation must always strive to get the best out of the market forces that enable competition. If we look at two examples, we look at telecoms, which is a very good example. We all know how that this started less than about 20 years ago, give or take. We have the regulator, NCC, we have the telcos. We've seen how they've grown over the years. And there's some good level of regulation. Their tariffs are fixed for social consideration. And we've seen that there's been a good balance in performance and the results. They make money. Customers are fairly happy, not as happy as they could be, but you could say a big contributor to that is the dearth of infrastructure we have around which they have to work. Another sector you can look at is cement, where you have the likes of Dangote, who is a near monopoly. And there is really the regulation is much less. So you have to ask, when you get into a monopolistic situation like that, is there fair competition? So there's less regulation in that situation. And so can you say that, shouldn't the market be tweaked? Recently, BOA said that, there should be, government should more or less make competition, easier, meaning that let everybody compete better, let prices fall better. And that would be better for everybody. So yes, the monopolistic tendency in that situation may enable more profits. They are declaring profits that are, very humongous in this day and age. However, private sector operating through the market and competitive forces help to ensure efficient allocation of resources. So we should always look at a fine balance between regulation and also the beneficial effects, as it, in terms of the impact, so that we avoid cases of market failures. Because in achieving this objective can arise where the marginal social benefits are not equal to marginal social costs. The monopoly situation I just gave, or near monopolistic situation I just gave of Dangote, can lead to, or where you have externalities, like the situation where factors outside of an industry would impact on it, and they must take care of the issues that arise from it. The states, through the government, we need to intervene sometimes and correct these market failures or market situations, so to speak. And I'm sure we've seen that happen. NCC has come in, using the same example I gave before, has intervened in the markets at times. We've seen the situation with tariffs for power, how they've gone up at an incredible rate. That shows, I think most people will say that the regulator is not doing very well there. But then the regulator is trying to ensure that the private sector gets what is due to them in that instance. So that's another good example of trying to avoid the market failure. The regulator had to step in, increase the tariffs. We don't like the tariffs, but if we look at the tariffs from an international perspective, they may not be too high. But, that's where we are with it, because the operators, they need to get fair value for their operations, basically. So regulations must also be based on principles of neutrality, transparency, rule of law, and institutional enforcement. And if we have all this, it would work so much better. But getting the balance right between how much regulation and how well market forces and competition is what is very key, is to enable that. Regulation must be tooled in a way to enable competition to get optimum benefit, social and private, from the market. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. I think it's clear to everybody that regulation is very important, but regulation must then not stifle industry, is what I took away from that. Let me go to Ms. Odeleye here and say, what can we do to ensure that regulations are based on the best available information and technology?
Hello again, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with my co-panelists and to be at the Lagos Economic Summit. I will just say, in response to your question, to make sure that we're getting best-in-class regulation, I think research is always very important. And I don't know how much thought goes into planning before changes are made, before prices increase for things. I don't know if it's always benchmarked against inflation rates, or if it's arbitrary, and the populace won't know that as well. but there has to be research, and it has to be open, and it has to be transparent. It has to be empirical as well. So strengthening research agencies in the state, even at various levels, from the local governments to state, to the state government level, is very important. I recall living in countries outside Nigeria, and you wonder why they keep sending information to field surveys, why the Office for National Statistics is asking for, asking questions about how many people live in your household, how many, do you have access to broadband? But, it's really important information that helps planning. And without this kind of information, decisions will be taken arbitrarily. There'll be no basis for it. It will obviously not favor the man on the streets, because you just don't have that information. If you don't know how much people earn, if you're just throwing ballpark figures, or if you're working on situations like, say, minimum wage, you're not going to have the actual figures that you need in terms of planning, regulation, and making changes. And I think that technology is very important in this regard, not only for planning or for making regulations, but I think in every aspect. No longer is it possible, especially with COVID, for people to just knock on doors to get information. Of course, at grassroots level, you might have to do that. But in situations where a lot of people are online, you can send survey information. You can use regular technology without even having to go into artificial intelligence and machine learning. Just technology to be able to reach people, to get information that's required. You also can use AI and machine learning for projections, as well as planning, forecasting, pretty much. So there's all sorts of technology that can be embraced, but very importantly, in terms of communicating with the populace of the people that you're regulating, technology is a very good tool. In terms of research as well, technology is a very, very good tool. We can use it for forecasting, like I mentioned earlier. So it's just a combination of strengthening our research agencies, of course, using qualified people. It is not, just a matter of collating information. Information is useless. Rather, data is useless to you if you don't take that and turn that into information. So having qualified people who understand what the data that they're collecting is going to be used for, how to analyze that data and plan using that data, is also very essential.
Well, thank you so much. So what I hear is focus on research, and also the people that are there, so that they can help you turn the data you have into useful information. Thank you very much for that. Now, let's still talk about regulation and its effect on people. We know that we need it. I'll move on to Ms. Oyewole. If you could tell us, what are your thoughts on encouraging experimentation and learning with regulation before it's finalized?
Thank you very much to our moderator. Good evening to our distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be on this panel with the other panelists. The discussion with regards to regulation is a very interesting one, and I think I would take it from the perspective of what exactly is regulation supposed to be doing. Regulation is supposed to expand on an already existing law. It is supposed to lay down the procedure. It is supposed to make things as clear as possible, which is why, touching on Funkola's point, it is important that whoever it is that drafts these regulations understands the law and also understands the business environment. It is also important that whatever regulation is being put out there is clear and unambiguous, so that people understand it. The purpose of the regulation is not to create uncertainty. It is not to cause confusion. Rather, it is actually to lay down the guidelines and policies, so that whatever the regulation is focused on, whatever the subject matter, that it actually carries out its purpose. When you want to draft regulations and laws, typically there has to be consultation with stakeholders. And the purpose of these consultations is so that you can hear from all who are directly involved where this regulation, where this subject matter is concerned. And they can put in their own experience, they can put in their own knowledge for the purpose of coming up with a regulation that makes total sense. I need to add one more thing. We're in the fourth industrial revolution, and we all know how technology is moving. It's moving at the speed of light, and law typically struggles to keep up. So it is imperative, it is important that the regulations are routinely reviewed to ensure that they are actually applicable and doing the job that they are set out to do, and so that they don't become irrelevant and are actually no longer useful for the purpose that they were set up for. So I think I would round up on that point.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Oyewole. So in terms of experimentation, let's ensure that we gather the relevant stakeholder feedback to ensure that the regulations are then fit for purpose, and we're not making regulations that we have to then either change very quickly or that will not achieve the stated purpose. Thank you very much. We'll move on to Dr. Kemi Da Silva. I'd like your views on this, given your background. What are the special issues, problems, and controversies arising from regulations?
Well, I'd like to start by saying thank you for having me on this panel. I'm very glad to be here this evening. I think through my lens, which is women, disenfranchised women, and when we talk about controversies specific to this issue, I think we're all very familiar with what these controversies are. We look at issues of women's and women's rights in a country that's patriarchal, and we know that immediately we're not on an even playing field. When we talk about regulations and regulatory bodies in my line of work, we try to look at it through the lens of a solution-driven approach, because we need accountability and we certainly need monitoring of these initiatives that are supposed to be implemented to assist these disenfranchised women. So under the health, for instance, we want to ensure that regulatory bodies, following on from the previous panelists that have established these laws and have outlined these laws, as Sandra rightly said, are available to ensure that these laws have been implemented. If we're looking at the health sector, for instance, and we're looking at disenfranchised women, in Lagos State, there are only 2 sexual assault referral centers. There are 22 million of us, and 15 million of us account for the most vulnerable. So therein lies an issue, because we have a regulatory body. I'm assuming that regulations have been put in place, but then there's capacity building. We don't have enough of the necessary services to be provided for. And so we have that issue and that, if you will, controversy. The same applies in education, where we have approximately 600 students in the most vulnerable group. And we're trying to implement monitored initiatives to address the issue of gender-based violence, for instance, and rape and sexual violence in this community and in this target audience. And we rely on regulatory bodies like the Ministry of Health, tutor generals, and school authorities. But again, the controversy may very well be that there's just not enough of them. So again, the issue of capacity building has to be resolved. And then finally, on a community level, we run into challenges when it comes to formalized and informal regulatory bodies, especially in the rural sector. And so there needs to be a more coordinated approach in addressing these issues, so that at least through our lens, we're able to effectively and efficiently implement our initiatives, and they're monitored by the right regulatory bodies. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Da Silva. So I heard you very clearly say that there are not enough resources to deal with the number of cases we have, especially as regards the amount of vulnerable people we have in Lagos, and that's something we should take seriously. 15 million, according to your numbers, and only 2 sexual assault centers, if you will. It's certainly not enough resources, and capacity building is something that we must then focus on. Thank you very much for your contributions. I'm going to go back to Funkola, if you don't mind, very quickly. When we were talking, you spoke about the need for to base regulatory decisions on best available technology. What kind of infrastructure do we need to put in place to gather better feedback?
And there's so many, and I would say that it would depend on what we're trying to achieve here, and so you can't. It's not a one size fits all approach, depending on what kind of regulation you're aiming for. Obviously, if you're trying to do something for women and children, like Auntie Kemi said, you're going to have to do. You have to make sure it's not just technology that gathers information, but it's also something that can be used even in healthcare agencies, because again, a lot of statistics about women, a lot of things that you can glean and garner about women, you can find it through their health records. You can find it through like primary health centers. So it has to be technology that can be easily adopted and used in these scenarios and in places where, you know, you can gain information. If you did ask me to fill a survey today, I'm not going to tell you anything about, say, my reproductive records, unless, you know, I will tell my doctor that as well. So in using technology, you have to have something that can harness information from different places. So you can take, say, my basic biodata or information from maybe my local government or from the passport office. But if you want to be able to make regulation in terms of reproductive health and all of that, the information that you will get that will be relevant to you will be from healthcare, you know, from the healthcare sector. So we will be needing things like technology that can, you know, aggregate data from different sources. And, you know, it could be anything. It could be anything as elementary as a cloud server where, you know, all agencies' information has to go into. It could also be, I mentioned forecasting earlier, so it will also have to be historical data. So again, if we're talking about things like reproductive health here, you have to have historical data. Anything I tell you today is only as good as the information that you have today. But if you want to, say, plan, again, sorry, I just keep using the women and children example, but say if you wanted to predict ovarian cancer and wanted to see if, by, you know, when I have to always go for a pap smear, and you want to make it necessary for this to happen in primary health centers, this is information that you have to have historical information. So this is the kind of technology that, you know, takes historicals and can forecast future data. Things like Microsoft Excel can do this, but, you know, now technology has gone a lot faster, and you can do this with AI and machine learning. And, you know, it's just you take information and you plot in existing information and can forecast future information for you. But beyond that, I think what I'm trying to say is it depends on what you're regulating for. You know, but more importantly, I think what we need is something that pulls information from different sources. Things like NIN registration that we're doing today, it's a bit frustrating for people because the same information that you're asking me to register for already exists, say, with the bank for BVN registration or with the passport office. Excuse me. So we need some sort of ways where these agencies speak to one another. We need APIs, open APIs, where government establishment, you know, can put information out there easily and people can connect to, and then of course only licensed people or people who on a need to know basis, but something that aggregates information, cloud server, so that we need to stop taking information in files and in paper formats. It's not sustainable. I mean, we can talk about fires and destructions and riots, and then that's all of the useful data that you have collected over time, just, you know, going to pits. So automating things and storing information in other formats apart from paper formats, as well as open APIs, a sandboxed environment to be able to connect, so that data that we have in different places can be used, you know, to create more information and more technology for planning is very useful. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. What I hear you say is eliminate government silos and let the government agencies aggregate information that they have and use them to create the regulations as needed, or to target the beneficiaries, if you will, of the regulation. Let me change tack a bit here and go to you, Mr. Drosi-Mietti. From a practitioner's point of view, just think about this one. Given your background in finance, and also the fact that you are currently the chairman of the Lagos State Security Trust Fund, how do we manage a lack of accountability and monitoring of funds that are assigned to regulatory programs? It's okay, you can carry on.
My part got a bit stuck. Basically, it's a follow-through process. It's not that we don't have the accountability in place. The problem is that there is no action. The institutions that are supposed to do this. I'll give an example. You could go to a public institution. You have auditors. And the auditor, I've been an auditor before. I've audited public institutions. And you see the green pen along the whole transaction from start to finish, documentation perfect. But then nothing goes right. But that's because there's certain things that go, where there is collusion, there are no controls. So if it's in cahoots with the system, nothing works. So accountability, and then there is no auditing at the end of the day. We've seen Niger Delta, we've seen the disaster that has gone on there. It hasn't been audited in so many years. NNPC has never, well, have they ever been audited? Not in recent times, maybe not in the last 20 years. So we have a system where the institutions that are meant to do the accountability, those that are meant to query, those that are even internally within those same institutions. You know, if Oga has done something, nobody says anything. Those who are meant to query, nothing. Then there is no record, meaning no audits being comprehensively done, external, in the case of parastatals. And then there is no accountability at the end of the day. Nobody is saying that refineries are not working, how much has been spent on it, why should we be wasting taxpayers' money, running into hundreds of millions of naira on it. So that speaks for itself. And, you know, all these things have to be put in place. They have to be put in a meaningful way. They have to be developed along the line. So the leadership and the people who elect the leaders have to make sure that there is a sinking in between those two. That's what has to happen.
Thank you. So we're not to pay lip service to auditing, and if we're going to audit, we must just carry on. Let me give a heads up to those who are joining us online. Please feel free, if you want to make comments on what we can do to solve the problems of ensuring that the regulations we have are adequate. You can write in the chat column what those suggestions are, what those solution suggestions are, so that we can carry on and review them and ensure that we make Lagos again a better place for all of us. For Greater Lagos, what we're doing here again is setting the tone for the next decade. So let's all keep that in mind when we're listening to the panelists as they proffer solutions to the questions that I keep asking them. The questions are meant to guide the progress of Lagos going forward, so please feel free. And if there's anybody here in the audience as well that has questions that can lead to solutions or even solutions for the regulatory space, please feel free and to start thinking of what those solutions are, so that at the end of the day or at the end of this session towards it, you can then make your suggestions as well. Moving along quickly, let me circle again back to Mrs. Oyewole. In your opinion, how can we right, please permit that. How do we ensure that our regulations provide more benefits than harm, Ms. Oyewole?
Thank you very much. I think it goes back to a lot of what was said in response to the first question, which is ensuring that those who draft the regulation have done the proper research, have conducted the surveys that they need to conduct, have a very good understanding of the environment, of the subject matter. And it is then that they can roll out regulations that are clear and unambiguous. if you have a regulation that is confusing, then it doesn't actually do the job. And the point of the regulation is to ensure that whatever it is regulating, the stakeholders, all those who need to rely on it, know exactly and precisely what to do. So I think that would be my comment on that particular question.
All right, thank you. So I'll move on very quickly to Dr. Tara then. How can we ensure that the vulnerable do not bear most of the costs of regulation? Sorry, Dr. Kemi Da Silva Ibru.
All right, thank you. So with regard to ensuring that more vulnerable groups do not bear the burden, I think first it's important to identify who these stakeholders are. I mean, these are individuals that are beneficiaries of some form of assistance, be it in a program form or an initiative or a service. And these services traditionally are given by either non-profits like organizations that I work in, or even governmental organizations that are represented in all the different ministries. So it's important to identify who they are, and it's also important to identify who their partners are in these different spheres, both governmental and non-governmental, because that's where the accountability comes in. So once you identify who your partners are, and then you make them accountable, then by that same token, you're protecting the more vulnerable, and then you're ensuring, at least in many a time when you're implementing programs, that they have programs that best serve them, and then they don't, unfortunately, either bear the cost, whether it's financial or whether it's social. I think that would be my comment when it comes to ensuring that the more vulnerable group are protected in an environment that regulation is necessary and needed.
Thank you for that. So identify what they need and then ensure. It's a very important question. So again, I'm going to leave it open. Is there any other panelist that wants to address this one? How do we ensure that the vulnerable do not bear most of the costs? Please feel free if you want to jump in. And if you don't, then I'll move on. Mr. Drosimiati again, how can we prevent insiders from gaining an advantage? Mr. Kende Drosimiati.
Yes, a very good example is the stock market. I like being very practical, I mean, rather than just talking. And when you talk about insider trading, first of all, a company is supposed to work within certain parameters and principles. Once they're listed, transparency and openness in everything you do, and then there's a defined way you release information, and so if you breach that and you are caught, you should be sanctioned. We don't get a lot of that here, but it happens a lot in the Western world. Insider trading, people get some privileged information, and that's unfair competition. So sanction and a transparent an open process of accountability. Those are the two underpinning things that are key to making it work well. And then there must be sanctions at the end of it. So that way, we can avoid that undue benefit that some people can get. Thank you.
So I'm going to redirect on that one again, because when we started, we spoke about monopolistic tendencies of some people and how they got the regulations to work for them, either by an increasing absence of regulation in areas where they have monopolies, or by being able to influence the creation of regulations that promote them. These people can then be said to be insiders. How do we address this kind of issues. Mr. Kennedy Drusmiat again. I think you're on mute because we cannot hear you.
Sorry about that. You must, I gave examples of we have some strong regulators here, or fairly strong or resolute regulators like the NCC and the central bank. They regulate the industries fairly well. But we have an environment that's fairly hodgepodge. There's a lot of disparities here and there, information gathering, there's unevenness. So the level of consistency and quality is, met in many different ways. So you have a situation where a regulator in an industry that, where there's less regulation and there isn't a very formal independent regulator, like in those instances. And if the regulator is the ministry or it is self-regulation, meaning you have, where there's less formal regulation, it might be that there is more self-regulation by the market players. And in a monopolistic situation, that might be what may happen. And you find out that the regulator would be deemed to be weak and less effective. And so whoever has the upper hand can dominate and continue to dominate that industry. And we've seen that happen in one or two industries here, or quite a few. I don't want to mention names at this point. That's fairly apparent. So we've seen that. And there is less of formal regulation or a weak regulator and more of market-driven or driven by the players or the association. They are the ones who would enforce regulation more or provide more of the regulation, and then we have the situation that would come to arise.
All right, thank you very much. I think we're starting to see a convergence of sorts, where we talked about regulators must be strong. We talk about capacity already. So if the regulators know what they're doing, if they're properly selected and they have the capacity, and if we deliberately ensure strong regulation, then we will have less of, or we may have less of the insiders. Some of the, at the plenary session, one of the issues that was raised by one of the speakers is that there's a lot of abuse in our system, in our legal system. A lot of those abuses, according to the speaker, are perpetrated by the senior lawyers who are being looked up to by the junior lawyers who then try to outwit the system. It's the same, in the same vein with regulator. Now, Ms. Oyewole, I'm going to you. Given your vast experience, I'm going to ask this one of you. How do we fast track the bureaucracy for change to keep up pace with the realities of an increasingly competitive global economy?
Thank you very much. When you think of bureaucracy, permit me to use this language, it's a nasty word because it conjures up duplication of effort. It conjures up administrative bottlenecks. It conjures up a lot of red tape, which amounts to a waste of your time, your resources, and your efforts. It basically seems to frustrate whatever it is you're looking to achieve. Over the weekend, I had a very pleasant surprise. I went to DSTV box office for the first time in many months and found that the process to rent a movie had been simplified from what used to be counting many numbers, trying to see what they were, put them into my phone, just to rent a movie. And what DSTV had done was to simplify the process into a one-click on my remote. Instantly, my customer experience was good. It was a user-friendly friendly experience. And what that did was, it allowed me to decide that, look, I'm going to rent more movies over the weekend, which translated into money into DSTV's pocket. And it also meant that on this session today, I would talk about it and give DSTV some publicity, not that it needs it from me. But the point was that my user experience was friendly. It's the right thing. And that is the opposite of bureaucracy. It is not a user-friendly experience. So where am I going with this? You have Lagos State on this track to a smart city. It is a city of 20 million people. It's got numerous ministries, numerous departments, numerous agencies. How does Lagos State put in place what I would describe as a user-friendly ministry, department, and agencies? How? How does it create what I would describe as a customer-centric approach to its stakeholders? And who are its stakeholders? Its stakeholders are the citizens of Lagos and anyone that comes into Lagos State. Its stakeholders are some members of the public sector. Its stakeholders are the academia. How do you make our experiences when we come to process whatever it is that we're coming to process in Lagos easy or easier or better? If we look at the LIRS, for instance, they've digitized the payment of taxes, immediately cutting out the need for the middleman, immediately cutting out all that time that it would take to pay our taxes. Now you just go to their site and you follow the process and you've sorted out your tax payments for the year. To become customer-centric is not an easy thing. What it means is that Lagos State, the people within the Lagos State government, have to be customer-focused. The people of Lagos State must be front and center with regards to what the Lagos State government and its workers are actually doing. So it's one thing to say digitize, but do the workers actually fully appreciate what that digitization is going to do for them? In being customer-focused, there have to be surveys and feedback. The data that is gathered must be analyzed, and it is from that data that you come up with your plans that you need for the purpose of implementing a customer-centric Lagos State ministries, departments, and agencies. Excuse me. It is that data that will show that we need more training. It is that data that shows that we need strategic partnerships. It is that training that shows how the technology should actually be deployed to ensure that we get the maximum benefit from the services, from the policies, from the processes that Lagos State has to offer. And in drilling down into this customer-centric approach, it has to be approached from the SMART goals perspective. And by the SMART goals, what that means is that the plans have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be accessible, they have to be relevant, and they must have timelines associated with them. So you're constantly tracking how customer-centric Lagos State has actually become. Lagos State has done a lot of work in terms of training its workers, but it definitely needs to do more. When you're bringing in digitization, what is going to happen is that you have some people who will lose their jobs. And there is that concern that with digitization, that people will lose their jobs. And it takes, there's a story that I always like to tell with my IP background, which is that Queen Elizabeth I, in the 1500s, she refused to grant a patent to the knitting machine because, in her words, it would take away jobs from her subjects. But we all know what has happened, which is that innovation, digitization, technology, they actually create jobs. And the stats show that with digitization, you have more and more jobs. Yes, you take away jobs from some people, but other jobs are created. So coming back to the training, what else I would be saying to that, and speaking directly to Lagos State, is that in addition to training for digital skills, you also have to train people who are eventually going to lose their jobs so that they have new jobs, new skills that allow them to get other jobs. So in terms of coming back to that question on bureaucracy, it means that Lagos State has to become customer-centric. Everything it's doing is for the benefit of its people. And for that to happen, you need to go through the steps that I have outlined. Some of the world's most successful companies today, Amazon and Apple, are there because the way they approach their product and service is just to be as customer-centric as possible, and your user experience is just fantastic. And it comes back to the bottom line. So in terms of removing the bureaucracy, where I am coming from is very simple, which is you need to focus on the people who are in charge of all these processes, who sit at these desks, who sit in the ministry departments and agencies.
We're not wasting our times. I'm now going to pause a bit to see if we have any questions for the panelists from the viewers, both present physically and those who are online. You can ask the questions directly of the panelists, or you can ask an open question and one of them can choose to field it. And if they don't, I'll...
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Do I need to mention my name or something? My name is Tayo Bangushe Martins, and I am the Commissioner for Special Duties, Lagos State. First and foremost, let me appreciate the last speaker for her contribution. I think it was a fantastic one. You know, the one that dealt with removal of bureaucracy and all that. In fact, I got myself writing notes, you know, jotting down stuff when she spoke. Thank you very much for that. Now, back to the issue of regulation. This is an open one, so anybody can answer it amongst our panelists. Is there anything like over-regulation, you know, like excessive regulation, in the sense that, you know, such that you find out a situation where different regulatory bodies, for instance, now begin to have what we call overlap in their functions? I would like the panelists to speak to that. And also, you know, when we're talking about the vulnerable, you know, I was just thinking in my head, I was saying that, isn't it possible that certain regulatory or regulations can actually make provision, some kind of provision, waiver or relief for those that are vulnerable players? I would like them to speak to this. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. To the speakers, please feel free to decide if you want to answer this question. Which one of you wants to answer? And if you all want to, I'd appreciate that too.
I'll say something. Yes, there can be overregulation. Some may, I mean, I'll talk about excessive regulation, and I'll talk about banking. In the US, the Federal Reserve point of view, they feel that it's okay, or they have to regulate up to that extent. From the point of view of they may tell you that you need to have certain, they'll give you some requirements, and those requirements mean money you have to spend or deploy, you know. And you may assess that you don't have to deploy that amount, or you may not necessarily have to carry out those functions, and you'll still be okay. But they insist. That's part of what regulation does. And what it does is that you feel stifled. Small businesses out there, they have that same problem. The last president came in, removed a lot of regulation around small businesses, and that reduced their cost of doing business. So regulation has a correlation with cost of doing business as well. You know, in Nigeria, the banking industry obviously feels stifled, feels over-regulated, and it might be rightly so. for the same reasons I've given before. So there's something like that can be termed overregulation or excess regulation, definitely. And what it does is that so it's to seek the balance. When I spoke earlier, I said to get the right balance between regulation as opposed to, from the government point of view, and self-regulation. There has to be that right balance to get the optimum social and financial benefit. Social benefit, which is what concerns the government, financial benefit, which is what concerns the competition. People who are competing, basically. So really, it's there. But those are the obvious examples I can give. There might be others. Thank you.
I think I'd like to add a few words, if I may.
Please go
I'm
ahead.
not sure if my example is over-regulation or if it's just a function of a smoother pathway in the regulatory process. I'm going to give a simple example in my space. So we run a rape crisis center where women come in needing assistance. So these are women that have been battered at home and are seeking shelter and accommodation. We're in a COVID pandemic, so understandably, we're also very much aware of the risk of transferring the virus from the community to others. When a woman comes in and she's in need of assistance, the very first thing that one ideally should do is for her to get a COVID test. However, in spite of the fact that we have been registered to see her and assist her, we are not registered to assist her by implementing a COVID test. So we need to ask her to leave our facility and seek this particular service with a registered regulatory lab, or rather regulated lab. At the lab, she needs to be unwell. She needs to have, again, designated criteria, listed questions asked that she needs to fulfill. Is she sick? Does she have a cough? Has she lost her sense of smell? She doesn't have any of these concerns. All she wants is a test so that she can seek services such as shelter. So she cannot get the test. She cannot afford the test. We can't give her the test in spite of the fact that all our services are free because we don't fall under the regulatory agencies that can implement this test. So this woman is sent back home to be battered again.
If I can also take a stab at this particular question. In some jurisdictions, what happens is that the government allows the technology to be deployed and waits to see how it unfolds before actually regulating. So in direct response to that particular question about whether regulation is needed, in some instances, and I'd say in the tech industry, sometimes it's actually best to wait, see how it unfolds, see what the damage may be if there is any, get a better sense of it, and then regulate afterwards. Kenya is a good example with the PESA. It wasn't regulated, it was allowed to evolve as it did, and it's ended up being extremely beneficial to the Kenyans. So I hope that helps to add an answer to the question that was asked.
Sorry, and just to also contribute here, I was going to say that the sum total of what I've heard from my fellow panelists, especially with in response to this question, is that regulation has to be agile. We can't have one regulation and then keep brandishing it in all situations. So the way that we make regulations in Nigeria and at the state level and even at smaller agency level, it's not very responsive. You can't, in the COVID example, for example, to buttress my point, we can't say because it's COVID, the same regulations stand. Regulations have to be agile. Some changes have to be made and rather quickly to be able to accommodate new situations and new changes. And so we have to do better in terms of being responsive to situations with our regulations.
I think a second part of the question was that in regulation, should we have a one-size-fits-all, or should we have some sort of waiver of regulation for vulnerable people, or should we allow the regulation to be suspended for vulnerable people? If anybody would like to take on that second part of the question.
I think our moderator is on mute. We can't hear anything.
Okay, so I'll keep repeating myself. All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, thank you. We had a technical hitch here. There was a second part of the question about regulation and its effect on vulnerable people. Should regulation be waived or suspended in the case of vulnerable people? If there's someone who on the panel would like to address that.
Well, I mean, I think to further buttress the example I gave, certainly, as Funkola rightly said, I don't think regulation should be abandoned altogether. I mean, that leads to some sort of chaos or anarchy. But it has to be willing to be adaptable. It has to adapt to the current situation and the environment that we live in. And a classic example is the COVID pandemic and the fact that the vulnerable are being affected because many a time in the space of gender-based violence, more and more women are trapped at home with their abusers. And sadly, many of them cannot leave because of the COVID pandemic, but then they have no options because they have these stifling regulations that prevent them having the option of doing so. So I think it's important to have regulations, but I think they need to be practical. I think they need to be adaptable. They need to appreciate the ongoing event and willing to pivot, as we all have, in situations that, especially precarious and uncharted terrain, like a pandemic, which we've never had to deal with before.
All right, thank you very much. And I think we have some of your answers. There's another question from the audience for the panelists. Please go ahead.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you to our panelists as well. My name is Olajide Oduyoye. Just a very quick question. How would a panelist, and any one of them, would advise government on how to balance political gain from regulations? And I'll give an example. Recently, an existing law is being raised that we need to regulate the movement of trailers and trucks on timings and specific routes. And this clearly would affect their operations as it is. And we know that the union or the transport unions across the board, they are very, very politically savvy. And how would the government balance between the regulation to make sure that other citizens are okay, as opposed to the political downfall that can emanate from such regulations? Thank you.
If any of the panelists would like to take on that, regulation versus political considerations, or regulations in the face of political opposition.
I'm not sure if this is if this is the answer that our questionnaire, the person who asked the question is seeking. But I'll have to say that a law or a regulation is only as good as enforcement. And so if you're going to make exceptions, and if some people are not going to be covered by, a law or regulation that is made, then it is pointless. So if you're going to say no trailers or no tankers, but there's somebody who's the friend of the governor, or who's really close to the government, who has to move his trailers, then what is the point if this person is exempted? It's just, anything that is not does not apply to the entire populace, and the exceptions are made for political reasons. It's just going to be hard to keep track of. There's just not going to be. No one's going to take it seriously, and that's really so. There's no point making those laws if they're not going to be enforced.
We have precedents on the land border closure where exemptions were given. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just telling you because. We also, for the lawyers here, we work on precedents just to buttress or to counter what you're saying. I don't know how that goes.
I'll take a stab at it as well. If we're building Lagos, the city of our dreams, then such a scenario should not even arise. And I'll take us back to the point of being customer-centric. The laws, the regulations that are made must be for the good of people. It's that simple. We know it's not that simple in reality, but that's just what I have to say. And I think I'll even throw in something else. One of the things that we have here is a situation where a lot of the regulators are also competing in the same space with the stakeholders. So that is another keg on its own that we have real issues with. So we have a lot of things to deal with and take care of.
Right, so I think that was another take on insider ability to affect regulations, and thank you for the responses. We have one more question here from the audience, and this will be the last question we're taking. Please go ahead.
My name is Dr. Adams Adebayo. I'm the Lagos State Chairman for Micro, Small, and Medium Enterprises. My question goes thus. Who take the responsibility for an infraction being committed by an officer of the state or federal? In one of the section breakouts, we are SAN candidate Johnson mentioned that without the citizen, governance will be very difficult. And when you now look at it, that if there is no ease of doing business, if there is no ease of doing business, how do we achieve a greater Lagos for the economic that we are talking about? Let me give you a scenario that happened, it's about a year. It happened on 18th of January, 2020. One of our members was coming from Ogun State and coming to Lagos with day-old chicks, a poultry farmer. Going to Imota, was accosted at immediately after Ojodubaga by the Federal Road Safety Corps. Having a day-old chicks, the offense, well, so many offenses definitely will be counted on a counter that is rough and not too good, or motorable, or not too good for the road. Yes, apprehended. Now the driver solicited that is carrying a day-old chicks, over 3,000, and that same vehicle was arrested, detained. They allowed the driver to move, detain it till the second day. The old 4,000 day-old died. They have calculated it, running to about almost 6 million naira. Now, we wrote a letter to the commissioner, the state, and said it's a federal. Federal executive arrested in a state that need to grow and get economic power. And an injustice to one is an injustice to all. And we wrote to the Senate, we wrote to the Vice President and others. Up to today, we didn't get head to that case as it's still on, but we are looking at it from the angle that it's an infraction committed by the law officer, probably doing the right thing, but at the wrong timing. Because if he had allowed the man to evacuate or let them transfer and make an alternative, this is some people's life savings and investment. Then how do we go about that in terms of regulation and infraction committed by an officer? Thank you.
All right, thank you. If any one of the panelists would like to field this question, or what solution could we have for an offense committed by an officer?
I mean, sorry, I could give you the black and white answer and say that if you commit an offense in the course of your duties, then by vicarious liability, your employer should be liable. Of course, in the case where your employer has, and this is just if it's not a crime, if this is like a civil offense or something in this instance, some commercial loss, it ordinarily should be your employer. But I think the major question I should be asking here is that was it an offense by the law enforcement officer who who was carrying out his duties at the time. So, you know, these are the kinds of things that, unfortunately, they usually submitted to court for interpretation. Because, yeah, I could give you the black and white answer and say it should be the employer. But in the first place, would it be agreed that a wrong was done by the enforcement officer in carrying out his duties? So I don't know if anyone else would like to contribute anything to that.
I'll jump in there as well, just to add on without repeating is there insurance on the chicks? So that's one thing that I'd be looking at. In a perfect world, you should be able to report, and you should have that comfort that there will be an investigation, and that ultimately, if there was a wrong committed, that there will be punishment. Unfortunately, we see too much of these infractions going on where there's typically no punishment. In fact, I need to be very careful there. We don't hear that there has been any punishment, and in many cases, there is actually no punishment. So it's just a very unfortunate situation. From a private sector perspective, the owner of the chicks should consider insuring and then report. So I hope that also adds to the answer to the person that asked the question.
And I think finally, just ensuring that we do have reporting channels that have been, clearly outlined for situations like this. I think that was also something that, want to make sure that it's been put in place. So like you rightly said, both Funkola and Sandra, so that indeed, if it is something that needs to be reported, that the channels are open and available and are clearly outlined. And it's certainly ensuring the CHID, as Tando rightly said, would be another option.
Right, so I think we've run out of time. So I think the topic today was balancing regulation and economic growth for Greater Lagos. And I would like to suggest that if we're trying to set the tone for the next decade, we've started today. And I imagine that as we carry on with regulation, or trying to balance regulation and economic growth for the next decade, we have a few gems that we're taking away from the panelists today. I want to thank you all for your contributions. I want to thank you for your candor. I want to thank you for your openness and your willingness to participate in this program. And I want to appreciate you on behalf of the Governor of Lagos State and the Executive Council. I want to thank you again for having been a part of this, and I wish you a lovely evening, and thank you again. Thank you very much to our panelists, and also to the people who are watching us or who are listening and watching online, and to the people here who are present here. I want to thank you for participating in this edition of Engbeti, especially in this particular panel. Thank you again, and have a lovely day, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Very much for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.